Are theaters dead? Is Hollywood nothing but a woke agenda factory trying to indoctrinate us all? What's the hero's journey, and why is it everywhere? We talk about all this and more with a special guest on this episode of Faith and Pop Culture.
Hey, well, what's up, everyone? Welcome to episode number 12 of the Faith and Pop Culture podcast. It is me, your host, Daniel, and I am joined at the desk, as I always am, by the original Disney classic to my soulless live-action remake, Mr. Samuel David Kemp. What is up?
Oh, not too much, Daniel. It's good to be with you and our special live audience guest.
So this is exciting because I've been trying to add a little higher class and intelligence to my co-host spot, but I've been stuck with Sam all this time. But we are not alone. The duo has become a trio. So we are joined today by a very special guest, Mr. Mike Blackaby, a pastor, author. Biggest claim to fame is that he is my brother, that somehow lived in my shadow despite being several years older. So welcome to the Faith and Pop Culture podcast.
Excited to be here. I watch you guys online, and it's fun to be on this side of the screen.
Which is probably a total lie, because I don't know if you've ever tuned into our podcast.
I'm a faithful watcher and listener.
He sees the announcements come by.
Good. The check's in the mail, Mike. Thanks.
Yeah.
But Mike's in town. We've been filming some stuff for a new book, and we thought we would drag him on because you do have some interesting takes, perspectives on things, and just get him to dive into some pop culture stories.
A broken clock is right twice a day. So.
Yeah, sometimes by accident. I have some interesting
Hopefully
things.
we have scheduled it for one of those two times. But this has been an interesting week, kind of some interesting just pop culture stories and discussions that I thought we could dive into. But kind of the first one that just sort of stood out to me, we just came off of Memorial Day, at least here
in the States, yeah.
In the States, enjoyed the extra day of relaxation and overeating food. And kind of one of the stories that came out as far as pop culture with Memorial Day is that the box office was not enjoying the long weekend as much as some of us were, because things did not go well for the box office. In fact, the kind of the box office gross of the new movies that were released was about the worst that it has been in 3 decades. The movies Furiosa, Mad Max Saga, and Garfield, as well as the new Angel Studios film Sight, all released, and none of them made a whole lot of ripples. I think Furiosa and Garfield tied at around $25 million. Which, to break down some of the box office, and we can kind of get into if this means anything or if it doesn't mean anything. Kind of the overall, according to Variety magazine, yearly box office is down 22% from last year, 41% from 2019, and kind of this same weekend last year. Memorial Day, like the amount of money and people going to the theater is down 36%. So not looking good. So Sam, maybe you first. I guess, is our movies dead? This
is clearly a sign that as Jerry Seinfeld pointed out a few weeks ago, that the movie industry, Hollywood, it's on life support, and this is just it's in the death throes here. This one weekend is obvious proof of that. No, but I think it's a bad weekend for movie sales. Yes, historically maybe Memorial Day was better, but I also think a big part of it is what movies are playing. So it would be interesting to me to see, okay, well, what was playing last year and the year before that and the year before that. But again, there is an overall trend of fewer people going to theaters in general because there's just never been so many options for people to be entertained. And so again, I think sort of bad numbers, people like to jump on and say, hey, this is it, this is the end, and this is, Hollywood's dying and the theater is dead and all this other stuff, except, when Tom Cruise makes a movie or, when
Christopher
Nolan drops something.
And movie theaters are back.
Yeah, so I don't know, Mike, do you have a different thought on that? Or
I find it hard to believe that a Garfield movie didn't pull in bucket loads of money. I think you look at what is playing and you think, well, is there anything that's super wide mass appeal? And arguably, no. Mad Max
clearly not.
Slightly niche. Garfield, my kids love Garfield, and I can't think of anything I would rather not see than the new Garfield movie. And so, yeah, sometimes it may just be there's nothing, and everyone's always trying to figure out where will lightning strike, what is the kind of movie that will get people to not just watch something on streaming and actually go to the movie theater. And I don't know. I don't know that anybody really knows what that magic thing is, but every time it doesn't happen, people probably get a little worried, like people just don't go to movies anymore or whatever.
Yeah, because that's sort of, for me, like as Christians, does it necessarily matter how much money the new Garfield movie makes at the box office? Like, probably not. Is that it's a trivial thing? But I do think what some of this, just the kind of the cultural reaction to these sort of narrative, the box office, and cinema's back with Barbenheimer, cinema's dead, cinema's as soon as Inside Out 2 arrives, and people like movies again, and is that I feel like it does reflect just which will lead into sort of our next story too, but just the tendency we have to fall back on these like simplistic narratives of like, hey, movies didn't do good this week, therefore like this 100-year-old industry, like no one cares about it anymore. Not that it's a kid's movie based on a property that, it's funny that your kids, like my kids had never even heard of Garfield. Like, Garfield hasn't necessarily been, like there hasn't been a Garfield movie. And like
my kids want to see the Garfield movie. And so me and my wife are flipping a coin to see who has to take them. But some of those things you have to measure over longer periods of time. Like you can't just flip flop. You have to say, okay, so are people in general just going to less movies after COVID or with all these streaming services? Like I know for my wife and I, she would way rather stay at home in her jammies on the couch to watch a movie than to actually go to a theater. And so now that streaming services offer so many movies, then she would way rather do that. I like going to the theater, but I'm not going to go see Garfield in the theater. Like if I'm going to go to the theater, it's going to be more for like an event. Event movie, and maybe there's more and more people who are making that choice. Like, what will pull me out of my house to actually go to the theater and see something?
I feel like that is, which is why some of these like events, like Oppenheimer, Barbie, like why those do well, is that I feel like streaming has changed maybe like the standard of what we, now we can have so much available streaming like we didn't used to have. That like, now we want what we see in theaters to be like an event, something
really
big.
Worthwhile. Well, and I think I have heard sort of the refrain often that like, like why was this movie not just released to streaming? So I think there's so many movies now that's going to be the justification. Is like, if we're going to release this theatrically, it better be able to bring in the money. Otherwise, like, why not just send it straight to?
Do you need to see Garfield on the IMAX screen, or can the point come across in your living room?
And I do think like it's almost like there's like a spiral to it, because it's like as an audience, like we want it to be like an event, a spectacle. So like a lot of the blockbusters and stuff now is this very CGI action spectacle, which doesn't necessarily make good stories. So like it's like we want something big. So they try to give us that, but they've lost some of like there is a sense that like the movie and filmmakers are trying to figure out what does that look like, what will draw people in. That's a big enough spectacle without losing sort of the stuff, like the more emotional, deeper stories. But it's that we would mention that because it does, I think, tie into kind of maybe a more relevant or meaty story just about narratives, like the way that kind of the movie industry has been changing. And if you guys have been following the podcast long, there are a few things that I enjoy as much as just some grumpy Hollywood guy shaking his fist at younger Hollywood people. Like you always have like Scorsese or some of these guys that just, back in the in the day, the golden age, we were doing this, and I get amused. Ridley Scott is always good for it's a grumpy quote, and I like grumpy quotes. So this week, the grumpy quote of the week comes from John Musker, who's really a legendary director / animator for Disney. He's the co-director of The Little Mermaid, Aladdin, Moana, and The Princess and the Frog. And I don't even see like what provoked his comments. He just had something he wanted to get off his chest, and he was interviewed somewhere about it, and kind of calling out like modern Disney for just sort of how they've lost their way. Maybe kind of given into some more political over this the classic stories that he used to be telling. So here's some of his quotes, and then we can maybe break them down a bit. He said, "I think they need to do a course correction in terms of putting the message secondary behind entertainment and compelling story and engaging characters." And he continues, says, the classic Disney films didn't start out trying to have a message. They wanted you to get involved in the characters and the story and the world. I think that's still the heart of it. You don't have to exclude agendas, but you have to first create characters who you sympathize with and who are compelling. And kind of later in the interview, he sort of gets a bit more in detail about like the agendas and the messages are like it's political or sort of wokeism or sort of some of these things that that have sort of, in his opinion, derailed Disney, which aren't an uncommon, like, that is a very much a prominent, like, opinion and like, discussion about particularly Disney, but just like family entertainment, that it's, you know, we've sort of lost something and it's just become all about agendas and kind of pushing these, you know, these messages and kind of they've forgotten just to tell good stories. Sam, where do you fall on this? Are you? I know we've touched on some of this before, but are you pro Musker? Or are you?
Well, I don't think it's maybe as simple as that. Despite like this and you know the previous box office thing, I think when we condense things down to like simplistic narratives, it can be easy to sort of join a camp and just you know plant your flag there and say, hey, look, you know Disney just needs to wake up and start making good movies again. But I think really it comes down to, it depends on what data points you want to look at. And so I think for him, you can pick out some maybe recent Star Wars, maybe a few particular animated films and say, look at all of these and how bad has Disney gotten. But I think if you look at other recent Disney movies or animated films, it would tell a very different story. And I think just like the whole, you know, Disney Plus fiasco and people wanting to cancel their subscriptions because, you know, they're going woke or whatever. And then Disney brings on The Chosen and it's like, oh no, like I just canceled my Disney subscription. I thought they were woke, but now they have, you know, a show about Jesus. Like, what do I do? And so I think it depends on how you look at it, because I think there are both, which is a very unsatisfying talking point to say, you know, both happen.
Yeah, because Mike, I know you, like some of the stuff that we've done with our writing and just with your like ministry has been like looking at just sort of narratives and like how these narratives take place, and you know, like is sort of our default posture as people to just try and simplify and like, you know, turn every situation into like a heroes and villains, good, bad. They do this, direct causation because of this one thing. What are some of your thoughts on this?
Yeah, well, I think stories are the most powerful way to get across a message, and so I think oftentimes messages will be woven into stories, but probably often less intentional than we think. So just our worldview is always going to be sort of implicit in what we create, and so there'll be messages in things, and probably overblown if we think that there's a writer's room that is starting with, this is the message we're trying to get across, now we got to build a story around it, but probably not overblown to think that all of us are gonna put our worldview into what we create. And so if you think there's a bunch of Hollywood types creating stuff, then there's certain worldviews that are going to just implicitly get put in things, but probably not as quite as nefarious or intentional as as the critics think it is. But also, we receive messages and morals and stuff through stories, and so I think oftentimes when we get a story, we're looking for some sort of message. We draw things out of it. And oftentimes I think the creators would probably be like, oh, that wasn't even our intention, but great that you got that message out of it, right? Because we see ourselves in the characters and we sort of make those connections. Like, and so a lot of it depends on who's consuming it, right? Like we are constantly pulling lessons and morals and things out of what we watch and consume. And so sometimes you can see what you want to see in a movie, but you're right. I think in that we're always trying to simplify things into a narrative, and we all do that as humans. That's how we navigate life. And once we have a story that makes sense to us, it's really hard to change that. And so if we've already determined in our mind that Hollywood runs a certain way, then we're always going to find evidence for that, because we're always going to look for evidence for that. And very rarely are we going to be trying to look for evidence to disprove the story that we've created in our minds. And and we all do that, but I think you see it happening as it's always, divided into, we're creating our own narratives about what's happening in the world. And oftentimes we're on the good guys side, and the bad guys are doing this. And if you were to ask them, it would be reversed. Like, well, we're the good guys and they're the bad guys. And so which one is the true story?
Yeah, because it's always been one of the great like ironies to me is that like Christians and like tend to be among the most vocal about like, we don't need messages. We just tell me a story. And yet like faith-based films, I think like objectively are the most message driven. Like, feel like most of them come with like a curriculum. Like it's of the message.
There's
like,
a Bible study that goes with it.
And not even that that's bad, but like, like very much, but like, I don't think the creators necessarily would see it in that terms of like, hey, we're not doing this because we just have this agenda to convert the masses. I mean, some I think maybe approach it that way, but it's like, hey, this is important. This is my values. Like we're telling stories of people of faith because that resonates with me. And that's, I live in a world surrounded by people of faith. And, whereas, people that aren't Christian see those same, genuine messages and be like, okay, this is a sermon. Like I'm ambushed by this.
Well, when Christians do it, they want people to engage at a deeper level with what they've created. And I think probably the same with non-Christian art too. Like they would say, well, we do want it to be something that people can engage with and wrestle with at a deeper level. And when we do that, it's sort of a good thing. Like, this is good. We want there to be messages and themes and things that people can work through. And because we agree with those themes and those messages, we see it as a good thing. But we see it as a bad thing if somebody else wants to do the same thing, but with messages and themes and stuff that maybe is against our.
Because one of my slogans that I've always used is like, I don't think people really have a problem with preachy art. Like we have a problem with disagreeable sermons. Like if it's preaching to the choir, then we
love it.
That's powerful. Like, isn't it powerful how the character gave the gospel presentation at the end? Like it's just if you go off of sort of what your own values are, then we just stick to the story. Don't try and push your. But again, I think there is nuance because I think is Disney the sort of this narrative true that is this sort of this one thing, this one entity that just hates Christians and conservatives and traditional values and their whole agenda is just to like deconstruct that. Like no, like are there people in Hollywood that are pushing their own views and want to do some of that? Like yes, and I think there's interviews with some of these creators that like where they'll say that and they're excited to be able to include these elements that are like there is agendas with all of some of that, but just sort of the nuance of like the causality of like our modern Disney movies failing at the box office or whatever just because of these messages. Like that's sort of the narrative that comes out. Or is it just people don't like bad movies? Like same as did Garfield have a bad agenda or is it just a bad movie? Furiosa, I actually thought it was a good movie, but like, did it do bad at the box office because it was pushing some agenda, or is it just a prequel based on a movie that did bad at the box office 10 years ago that no one really cared about? Like, is there more to it?
Advertising, was there any sort of advertising that hooked people,
Well, and also it was an R-rated film, so you're already like sort of cutting your potential audience as well for a movie like that. And so I think
are people invested in the previous Mad Max saga movies, or do they feel like they're jumping into a something that they're unfamiliar with and not interested in jumping into an IP that's already existing?
Yeah, because it's interesting. I went back and based on sort of this quote about just basically from the time Musker stopped making movies, it's all been political. But when he was making it,
he was the golden age.
He was the gold.
And there is an argument to be made that he made some of the best Disney movies.
And again, Moana's. It's almost 10 years now, but it's.
But I would call that a recent. Yeah.
Any of the non 2D animation to me, like, that's when the era switches to like 3D kind of animation. But we kind of went back in like the last year of just animated Disney movies to just kind of remind myself like what's come out. Like, has there been this sort of this deluge of these agenda driven political movies? And almost surprised, but I feel like a lot of the new Disney stuff is actually pretty good. Like, maybe not as like destined to be classics, but movies like I mean, say what you want about Frozen, but obviously that resonated with a lot of people, including Sam here.
Still does.
Big Hero 6, Zootopia, Moana, which is great. Ralph Breaks the Internet's great. Frozen 2, better than Frozen 1.
Yeah.
Big Hero 6 is great and very
I haven't seen that one.
underrated. Yeah,
Yeah.
like there's a lot of people, but Big Hero 6 is a good one that flew under most people's radars.
Except they made a TV show on it that is what this guy's talking about. I don't know
Yeah.
if where it was pushing the... But Big
yeah,
Hero
the
6,
Baymax show.
Yeah. Ray and the Last
recommend.
Dragon,
That's
good movie. I don't know if it's necessarily pushing agendas. Encanto, Strange World is pushing agendas. Wish, maybe not the best movie, but not terrible. But
I literally fell asleep during Wish.
it's like my kids, I thought it was...
My kids liked it
I thought it
too,
was fine.
I haven't seen it.
but they have low standards.
But like my issues with some of these movies
Don't watch anything.
weren't that, other than like Strange World, like my issues weren't that this is just an agenda driven, I'm being preached to. It's
Yeah.
just that like,
It was
this is
boring.
uninspired. Like, the songs aren't as catchy as the old songs. Like,
Yeah.
You can say especially, the live action remakes, like just that there is, I feel like as Christians, we need to be careful not to just sort of dumb down our approach of like, there's sort of this narrative, this simplistic narrative, and it must be true.
Right.
So therefore, anything that comes out of Disney is just sort of, that's why it does bad. It's not that, even the secular critics hated this movie that agree with the political stuff. It's not that it's just a bad movie. It's that
Right.
there has to be some attack on us and, this whole agenda.
We have to in some way be a victim of this. We can't just look at it and say, oh, these movies aren't doing so well for a variety of factors. It's this interesting thing that we always have to kind of tie it into, this must be going against us somehow. Like, we're a victim in this.
there needs to be persecution. It's not just that we're bad at our job or like, that one flopped or
Yeah.
for whatever reason this one didn't resonate. It has to be like there's some, they're out there to get me. It's like, you hear like I think Christians will say like, well, I'm just experiencing a lot of spiritual warfare. It's like, or you're just being a jerk, and it's like, these you can't always just default to like, well, I'm taking the high ground, and these attacks are because of my noble character. It's like, well, maybe you messed up there, and that's an issue. And I think to the other point, I'm glad that Disney has moved away from some of like the classic princess stuff because as a girl dad, it's like I'm happy to see heroines who are not just like sitting in a castle waiting to be rescued by like the knight in shining armor, and so I think those messages are good for young girls to see that like, no, you can go out there on your little raft and find the heart of Te-Fiti and do all these things. And so it's like, I think
Moana's a good one.
I think some of that's really good.
Even like Frozen, like things that where like the romance, like the relationship is like sisterly or it's like
Right.
Wish was sort of like that. It's family. It's not about her falling in love. Like it's like some changes aren't always bad. Like
exactly.
Not that you don't ever have the classic, knight saves the princess, but
Yeah, I mean, and there's
shifting,
nothing wrong with that. And I think it is good though to have a diversity of storylines and plot points that aren't just the sort of like, the Wicked Witch, the damsel in distress, the knight in shining armor. I think it's okay to kind of mix that up a little bit.
Things like teamwork, like
Yeah.
Moana is the heroine of the story, but Maui helps her. Like she
Yeah.
can't really do it all on her own. She needs help, and
Exactly.
Maui can't really do it all on his own. Like he needs her encouragement, and so you sort of have both characters.
Well, and you
agency.
see, and you see the sort of the growth of those characters over the film, and I think that's
They
what
both
connects with
fail. They
people.
both learn
Yeah.
from their mistakes, and then they come together and do something together that they couldn't do on their own.
Yeah, and to be clear, like, I think our point isn't that there aren't things that are agenda driven or messages that Christians or anyone should like engage with or like be aware of.
Yeah.
Like that's will filter in through all, and I think that's always happened. We're just a bit more like politically minded as we watch stuff.
Well, and we don't like it when other people do that, but we're fine to do that. Like you put yourself in someone else's shoes and say, okay, are Christians driven by an agenda? Like, are they the stuff that they create, the stuff that they do? Is there some sort of purpose that they're pushing behind that? And it's like, well, yeah, like we're probably the worst ones at it. It's like everything we do is like, okay, so how do we get the gospel in this, or how do we use this to further the kingdom? which is all good, right? We should do some of those things, but it's like it's okay when we do it, but if the world does it,
Yeah, and which always
That
grinds
may-
me, some of the double standards. But I do think overall, like, yes, there are those. The thing I think as Christians we just need to be more careful about is just sort of falling back on thoughtlessly on these narratives.
Yeah.
Like,
It's
Hollywood
lazy.
is this, or
Yeah.
Disney is this, and everything is,
because you're talking about thousands of creatives, and
And you
if you
just- you hear
paint
people
with a
talk
big
about-
wide brush,
because like you hear people make comments like Musker does about it's all political, but then if you like ask them like, okay, so like which ones, like what are the like, they probably have to stop and think, or like maybe they haven't even seen the movie, or like
Yeah.
there's a lot of like hearsay like in the culture narratives about things that I feel like as Christians we're called to go a little deeper. But one other thing, especially because we have Mike here at the desk for this episode, that I wanted us to touch on, because this is something that we have done some work with. I think we've shared this before, that we wrote a book that came out last year, God, Heroes, and Everyday Dragons, which conveniently has a Amazon link in the show notes, which you can order for yourself or your friend or your enemy. But kind of based on the classic narrative structure of like the hero's journey, which has been super like pervasive and like influential in Hollywood and really just in storytelling since the dawn of stories. Although it does seem like in some ways our culture is trying to like go kind of away from it. Maybe real quick, for those that like aren't, because like everyone's familiar with it, even if they don't know it in the terms of the hero's journey.
Yeah.
Mike, I know we've done we've done a bunch of work on the hero's journey. Sort of, how would you sort of describe like that structure of the hero's journey?
yeah, hero's journey is this is sort of the classic trope that you see in lots of stories and movies and everything, but a lot of times in maybe classic fantasy and myth is where you see it the most, where somebody is in a peaceful village or some sort of safe, normal environment, and then something happens, some issue comes up that launches them on a journey. Usually they got to leave the comfort of where they are, the familiar, and venture into the unknown. And there's always some sort of mentor character that either helps them to launch out or gives them wisdom along the way. And along that journey, they have allies and enemies. They have different things they have to accomplish. Their character has to grow. The hero at the beginning of the story is not ready or equipped to deal with the main conflict. And so they get prepped for that with smaller conflicts along the way until they get to the big showdown. They fight the big villain, or they have to solve the big problem. And then from that point, they learn something, they gain something, and then they journey back with this new knowledge or this new skill or whatever it is to then go and be a blessing to the people back in their village or wherever they came from. And usually a theme of death and resurrection. They come back a different person than they started. And it's this great trope that you see in Star Wars and Lord of the Rings and Harry Potter and Moana, and you see it in all sorts of our favorite stories. And I think you can really see some version of that in maybe just about every story. If you're aware of that structure, you can kind of start to see it everywhere you look.
Yeah, because that was the kind of what stories that have followed the structure have been happening since the cavemen were telling stories around fires, we assume, from the start of stories, and kind of where it became more prominent or known was when a man, like a mythologist named Joseph Campbell, started kind of putting the pieces together and doing some of the research, and he wrote a book called The Hero with a Thousand Faces, which is a super influential book. And another guy ended up coming along and adapting that for Hollywood, and it became sort of this template that like a literal printed out pamphlet that Disney and stuff would use to tell their stories, like The Lion King and some of those stories. And like you said, Star Wars, George Lucas would refer to Campbell as his Yoda. He based Star Wars was a retelling, a purposeful retelling of this myth. And it is it's even the new Planet of the Apes movie is almost to a T follows all the stages of the hero's journey, the mentor and the peaceful village, and sort of Campbell's argument was every story tells is a piece, at least a part of this.
Yeah.
Again, you can push back on that, and that he's being criticized, but I think you can't deny that it is everywhere. It is. Why do you think that is? What is it about this kind of specific kind of story template? Because either stories are purposely like unfolding it, or like, I think in modern times to not be influenced by it, it's almost like there's an attempt to sort of deconstruct it, which in a way is still very much just driven
still
by
based on that,
It's
yeah.
still based, and it's just trying to subvert it and do something different. Although that's sort of the basis of it. Like either
Well,
one.
I mean, I think like the hero's journey is, I think one of the reasons that it's maybe stood the test of time, if you will, is that it's something you can get your head around. So I think a lot of, in the context of movies, if you think about movies that don't do well, it's typically because there's not a real clear like hero's journey. And I started this documentary series called, I think, The Power of Film, and it's this guy looking back at all the movies that have stood the test of time and that are considered classics, and almost all of them center around a singular character. And it's that character's journey, and it's character driven. And I think that's part of the reason, because I think for us as humans to try and like see something that's not real like grounded in a person or two people, I think it just becomes much more difficult to track and to follow and even to be like invested in. But if you see like you can relate to and empathize with like one character's journey, you can sort of manage that, and you can, go with that person through that story, through that journey.
And usually that main character, they're written, I don't know if vague is the right word, but they're written in such a way that a lot of people can relate to them. And so they're not so developed that you're like, well, I can't really relate to this hero. Like there's something about them, something that they have to overcome. And oftentimes it's the story structure itself that we relate to. And so you can really plop in any hero. They can be, any gender, any race, like you can sort of pick anybody to fill that spot. And even if there's lots of differences between you and them, you can relate to them because of the journey they're on. Not even so much who this particular character is. Like, well, I didn't grow up in a small village, so I can't relate to that.
Tatooine.
But we've always, but I think that the hero's journey reflects our lives. I think so much we see our lives in terms of an unfolding story of a journey. We see our lives as this progressing journey that we're on, this growth that's taking place, and these obstacles that we have to overcome, and these allies that help us, and these enemies that try to thwart us, and these mentors that give us wisdom along the way. And because we view our lives that way, I think the best stories that have this structure are ones that we fit ourselves into in some way. And so if it's too abstract, if it like you said, if it doesn't follow some sort of story structure that you can track with, then it's hard to get invested in that, because there's nothing that puts us into that situation. We can't see ourselves in that. And ultimately what we even get into in our book is really the gospel is the original hero's journey. And so I believe like we're wired for that. We long for that story because we're part of that story, and there's a spiritual longing within us, and things like the hero's journey connects to that, and we love that because there's actually something in us that longs to know how to take that journey properly.
Because like even a lot of Christians, when they're watching this any movie or story or reading a book or whatever it is, like, we'll kind of like, they'll pick out like Christian themes, right? The Christ figure, like in a lot of ways, what they're doing is just pinpointing the hero's journey, like aspects of that, because the hero's journey reflects so much of the gospel and like this sort of this, universal, themes, and which is part of why I feel like in some ways, like originality is overrated in Hollywood. Like I know it gets elevated. We just need more originality. And so if you just look at the history of stories, like the power of stories is that you can tell some of these same classic sort of experiences. You can still do new stuff with them or try stuff and experiment. But there's power in retelling stories.
If you stray too far from that structure, then people don't typically connect with it. It's too abstract. And
because even like a lot of modern movies, like, it's become sort of like, cliche to be the hero's journey. So they want to like deconstruct it, and we just don't resonate with some of these like less sort of archetypal stuff in the same way.
I mean, I think if it comes back to if it's well done. I think if you can do it well, then you can do some deconstructing, and I think it can connect with people. But oftentimes those things that are deconstructed, it's just not done well. And so it's just not as interesting or as compelling.
And even if you are deconstructing it, oftentimes you're just focusing in on part of the hero's journey. You're just putting a little bit more focus on one part, and maybe you're not giving equal attention to the whole arc, but you're saying, well, what about someone's failure? Like, well, every hero's journey, they're going to experience failure along the way. But if you focus in, well, what if we just really focus on a character who continues to fail and the grief that they deal with in that and how they pull themselves out of that? Like, well, you're really focusing in on part of a hero's journey. What you're typically doing, though, is you're not necessarily telling the full story. You're jumping into a story, but you're assuming that your audience knows that you're jumping into the middle of a story, into the middle of a hero's journey, because they have to assume that this character came from somewhere to get to where they are now. And so the structure is so built into us that we can actually, with our imaginations, fill in the gaps and build the rest of the hero's journey into whatever we're watching to give structure to understand whatever part the filmmaker's focusing on.
And which I think is also why I think movies or shows that have like a more of a cliffhanger ending or an untidy ending, I think, and I mean, you can call them a cop-out sometimes, but sometimes it makes it more interesting because it leaves it up to the audience to decide, well, so what happens?
And we will fill in the blanks.
Right. And I think that's a great testament to good filmmaking is how much are you discussing this movie after you've seen it? Like, was it a dream? Was it not a dream? Like all of these sort of things that are left up to the audience as a way to engage them with the story that the storyteller is telling.
Because if we didn't assume that there was more to the story, then it wouldn't be a satisfying ending. We would walk away being like, they didn't finish that. Because we know that there has to be more.
Yeah.
And they might leave the more up to us to kind of fill in later.
Yeah, maybe sort of in conclusion too. Like I feel like, because there's just the question of like, why do we keep telling? Like, why is this sort of near universal story structure? And I know other people and theologians and stuff. Like, I do believe it's because it's tapping into sort of how we are wired spiritually. Like this is sort of our journey, the fall and death, resurrection, all these things that are just built into what the gospel is, kind of comes out in sort of how we're wired, like what we long for. And I do think that's why, as Christians, we can learn and like be edified by things that aren't just like The Chosen or like a faith-based thing, because even secular filmmakers are tapping into this life story structure that like is wired into us at like a deep spiritual level. And like, so even like the most atheistic director is going to be playing around with some of these experiences that as Christians we can kind of...
It also sort of lines up with the biblical narrative of creation, fall, redemption, like that basic story arc that you see throughout Scripture. You can plug the hero's journey into a version of that too, of where you start here and then some crisis happens and then you need to be redeemed from that. And which is why Campbell even talked about these this death and resurrection. Often a character goes through a metaphorical or even literal death and resurrection as well. Like you see the gospel play out through this hero.
Which is almost, I feel like, why I tend to be way more interested in like the non-faith-based stuff. Like there's lots of reasons, but I feel like there is almost a power to creators and storytellers like stumbling upon some of this stuff almost unaware, as opposed to like coming in with, we're going to tell you this. There's almost like a more like something more authentic and raw about like they're tapping into some spiritual stuff about who we are as people without even necessarily recognizing. But speaking of movies that may or may not contain the hero's journey, the next segment of our podcast we have out now and coming soon. So not a whole lot this week because the movie industry is dead. So not a whole lot to get into.
That's that. Thanks for coming.
Theaters closing all over the place.
But real quick, again, we have full reviews up on our website and our channel, so check them out. But kind of the three movies that came out last week: Furiosa, Garfield, and Sight. Very different collection.
That's the gamut there.
People might not be interested in going to see these, but at least you have options. If you want to see an animated family film, an R-rated adult, a gritty film, or a faith-based film.
Something for everyone.
So we'll, again, check out the full reviews. Furiosa, I actually enjoyed quite a bit, although I think it is, and like we were just saying with some of the hero's journey stuff, like the movie essentially unfolds like a retelling of the Old Testament, like visually, like, taking the fruit and leaving Eden. Like there's so much biblical stuff. I mean, there's also lots of violence and other things to
Well, the Old
Which is
Testament.
biblical.
Yeah.
so it's biblical in more way than one. I do think it's an interesting film, although not necessarily one that I would say all Christians should go rush out to see. Garfield, it was an animated movie. It was Garfield. I mean,
Not much to say.
it looked like Garfield. It didn't feel like Garfield. He wasn't grumpy enough for me. And then Sights, kind of the Angel Studios movie. I never saw how well this movie did. It doesn't seem like one that's like primed. It's a smaller story. Like, you don't expect it to like blow the doors off the box office. But I actually thought it was good. I thought it was an interesting
It's
film.
gained some good reviews. Like people are reviewing it and have pretty good things to say about it. Even those who aren't necessarily on board with kind of the faith that is.
Yeah, I saw even like
underneath
Variety
it.
magazine and Forbes, like at least the quotes I've seen. I don't know if the whole review is positive, but because it is faith based, although it's not like super in your face about it.
Yeah.
But yeah, it's interesting. It seems like people have appreciated the sort of the more uplifting story. But speaking of uplifting, things that I know I will appreciate, Sam will appreciate, and probably you guys will all appreciate. The final segment of this podcast episode, we have things we like that you should like too.
Well, first, an honorable mention. We mentioned Moana, and I think Moana 2, the trailer has recently dropped, and my little girl is obsessed with this movie. So we've listened to this movie or watched this movie probably hundreds of times. It's great. The songs are great, most of them. It's a total hero's journey. If you've never, for some reason, seen Moana, go check that out. But something that came across my radar a little bit more recently, it's I think it came out in 2020, and so it's not a new release, but on an airplane ride, I watched a Tom Hanks movie called News of the World. It's an old Western. Westerns may or may not be coming back. We're starting to see a few more of them. They're not super common, but just the story of, and I think it's the director who did the Bourne movies, and I think Captain Phillips, and so he's known more for these action movies. This one's a bit slower paced, about Tom Hanks as an old gruff cowboy who travels from town to town. It's sort of right around after the Civil War, and reads the news to people and kind of spreads news around the different areas. And he finds this orphaned girl that had been attacked, and basically she has no family. And so he takes her with him to go deliver her to some family that she has miles and miles away. And it's just their story. She doesn't speak English, and so he's trying to connect to this little girl while taking her through the dangers of the Wild West to return her to her family. And so much of the story is their bonding, right? He's a bit reluctant at first to even take her with him, but it ends up being a very sweet story of this man who's carrying a lot of brokenness in his own life, and really the love of this sort of daughter figure for him helps to rebuild him. Even as he's helping her, she really helps him too. And it kind of ends the way that you would suspect and hope that it ends. But I think the journey to get there is just really well told. And I don't typically love Western movies or dramas movies that are a bit more character driven, move a bit slower. But I was sitting on an airplane with nothing else to do. I thought I'd check it out, and I actually really enjoyed it. So it's a 2020 movie. I don't know where you can find it, but it's good.
Yeah, because you texted me about it, and that came right before we started doing the Collision review, so I hadn't heard of it.
It kind of flew under the radar.
Although you had me at Tom Hanks in Western.
Well, Tom Hanks is always good, and he basically plays Tom Hanks as a cowboy. But it's good. It's well done. And when you talk about a well-told story, even if it doesn't have all the action and stuff that maybe this director's other movies had, so if you're looking for just fast-paced, but a well-told story pulls you in. And maybe because I'm a father with a little daughter, I was pulled into that element of it too. It hit you in the feels. I'm sitting on the airplane now,
Yeah,
making a scene.
after becoming a dad, and especially a dad of girls, like there's been a few movies I've seen that have the a father-daughter storyline. You're just like, I didn't know I was so weepy.
Yeah. What's wrong with me?
Or the AMC
So, yeah.
line as Minions. But hey, take it from Mike. Check out that movie if you find yourself on an airplane or if you're just at home. I don't know what it's on. If it's on like Netflix or somewhere.
I'm not sure either. It's called News of the World with Tom Hanks.
But just
Google that.
But search it. But something that I have enjoyed is this episode of the podcast. This has been fun. Have Mike. Stay tuned if you enjoyed Mike. Even if you didn't enjoy Mike, still stay tuned because we might have him back in a couple not long from now to talk about some more stuff. But we thank you guys for joining us. Hope you'll join us next week every Thursday for another episode of just diving into interesting stuff and kind of engaging culture as a Christian. So we will see you then for more conversations on faith and pop culture.